Good day, everybody, and please have a seat. My name is Ilinka Benson. I am CEO here at SNS, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you all to this seminar, both you who are here today and you who are following us online. We're so happy that we managed to get this co-production together with Sieps with less than 6 weeks to the upcoming election to the European Parliament. It will be very interesting to hear what you have to say about the potential outcomes and also, of course, about the potential consequences looking further on from these elections. And we're very happy to have Professor Simon Hix here with us, who is also the writer and or co-writer of this short report that I hope you have gotten a copy of, and I'm sure that you can also download it on Sieps' website if you're not here today. And we're also very happy, of course, to have Sofie Blombäck and Susanne Palme, who disappeared, but who will soon appear on the stage. And I'm very relieved to now leave the floor to Göran von Sydow to lead us through this seminar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ilinka, and thanks to SNS for co-organizing this event here with us at Sieps. So I'm Göran von Sydow, I'm the director of Sieps, and it's my pleasure then to be the moderator of today's seminar. So nearly 5 weeks until the elections, and like many times before, people will say that these are the most important elections, European elections that ever been held. We'll see about that, but nonetheless, it's clear to say that we are living in a context that is indeed very challenging, with an ongoing war, of course, in Europe, international turbulence, but also a very ambitious EU agenda that has been rolling out over the last 5 years. In particular, you see the ambitions in terms of the climate policies that have been adopted, in industrial policies, in the new migration pact that has been agreed at the European level. And many, if not all of these issues will at some point pass European Parliament. And they have so over the last 5 years, and they will continue to do so also in the 5 years to come. And we are very happy then that we could publish this analysis by the eminent scholar Simon Hix and his colleague Abdul Nouri. Simon is Stein Rokkan Chair of Comparative Politics at the European University Institute in Florence. And he has been a leading EU scholar now for a long, long time. And he has studied European elections, electoral behavior, party politics, and also the life of European Parliament. So the seminar today will be organized in such a way that Simon will present the main findings of the report. And then we will have the 2 discussants here with us to bring additional light on these issues. But there will also be ample room for questions from you in the audience, so make sure to prepare questions. And that goes also for those of you following us online. So with that said, I will now welcome Simon Hix to present the report.
Thank you very much, Ilinka. Thank you very much, Göran. Thank you all for coming. As Göran said, I've been studying European Parliament and following European Parliament elections for quite a long time. I'm probably perhaps older than I look. My first study of the European Parliament elections was in 1994. Before many of you were born, I suspect. But when Göran said to me, Simon, can you write a report for us looking at what might happen in the elections and what might the policy consequences be of these elections? It was a great opportunity to look at what has happened in the current Parliament in terms of the patterns of the votes, the coalitions that have formed, and then to think about how the new Parliament, given the current opinion polls, what the new Parliament might look like, how will that change in the makeup of the Parliament feed through into change in the type of policies that we'll see Europe adopting. And so that's the challenge we set ourselves. So I'll say a little bit about the likely outcome of the elections. I'll say a bit about the current politics in the current Parliament, so you get a sense of where we're heading. And then I'll talk about how we think this might influence policy change, and I'll talk a bit about whether I think von der Leyen is going to get re-elected as Commission President. So on the left here, you have the current makeup of the European Parliament. On the right, you have the latest forecast from this group called EuropeElects. What EuropeElects does is collect all the opinion polls across Europe and say, if there was an election held tomorrow, what would the European Parliament look like? So on the left here, you see the political groups in the Parliament. the mainstream centre-right here, this is where Moderater sit in the EPP, the mainstream centre-left, this is where the Social Democrats sit, the Liberals in the middle here, these two political groups to the right, one more conservative, the Polish Law and Justice, for example, sit in this group, and Meloni from Italy in this group, and this is Identity and Democracy, a more radical right group where Marine Le Pen sits and Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. And over here we have the Greens, and then we have the radical left. The left parties sit over here. You can see it's a sort of balanced parliament. The three groups, the EPP on the centre-right, the Socialists on the left, and the Liberals in the middle, they form, in a sense, a governing coalition, if you like. That was the von der Leyen coalition that came together to support the election of von der Leyen as Commission President and to support her work package and to support her on a whole range of policies. In the middle here, the Liberals have been very pivotal in the parliament because unlike in national parliaments, you don't get this government coalition in every single vote. What you get is coalitions forming issue by issue, a bit like in the US Congress. There's no inbuilt government majority, sort of back us or sack us. So the commission builds a majority on the left, builds a majority on the right, builds a majority in the center, depending on the policy issues. And the Liberals then in the middle of the parliament are often pivotal. They're on the winning side in more votes than anybody else, because either they're in the middle or they form a coalition to the left or they form a coalition to the right. And what you can see with the new parliament, if the voting is as the opinion polls are predicting, and there's lots of other forecasts by other people, and they're predicting very similar outcomes, you can see a significant shift rightwards in the parliament. Firstly, a big increase in the seats in the two groups to the right of the European People's Party. So Meloni's going to win lots of seats in Italy, Law and Justice in Poland, Le Pen in France, Wilders in Holland, the AfD in Germany. In fact, you go round Europe and the populist right parties are either going to become first or second in pretty much every member state. We can, of course, the Sweden Democrats here in Sweden. And you can see this big increase in the groups to the right of the European People's Party. And Orban, who currently doesn't sit in any group, he's talking about joining this group here. And if he does, they become the third largest group in the parliament for the first time. So more MEPs to the right of the EPP than in the EPP. And secondly, a big shift rightwards means the average, the middle MEP is no longer in the Liberal. The middle MEP is in the EPP, which means the EPP are pivotal. They decide, is a coalition going to form to the left or is a coalition going to form to the right? And for the first time in the parliament, you could see majorities forming on the right without the Liberals. So if you look, for example, at the size of the coalitions, of the potential coalitions in the parliament, the grey here is the current parliament, the coloured bars are the new parliament. This is the traditional grand coalition of the centre-left and centre-right, well below 50%. This is the super grand coalition of the centre-left, the centre-right and the Liberals, down to still above 50%. And then you see how this centre-left coalition here of when the Liberals here vote with the other parties on the left, they currently just reach 50%. They will no longer reach 50%. And you can see how this popular right coalition of the EPP and all the groups to their right, for the first time, they do reach 50%. So this is the sort of left versus right, and you can see the big shift rightwards here in the parliament. And this is important when it comes to thinking about what issues do these guys vote together on. And so that's what I'm now going to talk about. So if you look at all the votes in the current parliament, so Abdul and I have a database of all the votes. There's been about 17,000 votes in the current parliament. And what's really striking is coalitions in the parliament are pretty stable by policy issue. So you tend to get a particular structure of voting by policy issue, and that creates some certainty and some stability for the governments and for the commission when they're dealing with the parliament. So you see this broad centrist coalition of these three groups in the middle on all these policy issues here. Notice particularly foreign affairs. So this is the coalition that always tends to vote together on Ukraine, EU sanctions against Russia, support for Ukraine, and so on. Then you see this centre-left coalition with the Liberals, the Renew group here voting with the left, and this currently is a majority on environment, civil liberties and justice and home affairs. So this is a lot of the migration issues, development, employment and social affairs, and women's rights. And currently, the Liberals don't vote that often with the right on a lot of EU legislation, like agriculture, fisheries, and industry and research. And what is really critical is to think this bloc that has currently been winning on all these issues will no longer have a majority. So on environment particularly is going to be particularly important when we think about what's coming up. So another thing we do in the report, and all the tables in the report are done by each policy area, they look a little bit complicated. It's actually very simple. What we did is we took the groups left to right, and we said, how many times do they vote together as a block? And you can see across the diagonal here, you can see how left to right, they vote more with the group next to them than groups further away. So you can see this is the Greens and the left voting together, the Greens and the Social Democrats voting together, Social Democrats and the Liberals voting together. And you can see how 87% of the time the Socialists vote with the Liberals, 80% of the time the Liberals are voting with EVP. A lot of votes are not contentious. That's why the numbers look like they're quite high. But if you look at environment, you can see how the colors change. You can see how the sort of colors are across a diagonal here, a little bit darker on the left to show how there was a bit more of a left block on average. You can look at the colors here. This is international trade, and you can see how this is a block of centrist bloc in the parliament, this grand coalition all voting together on the international trade issues. For example, trade agreement, the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, for example. And if we move to environment, you can see how the colors are darker here in this left-hand corner. This shows the bloc, the environment, pro-European Green Deal bloc in the parliament. This is the left, Liberals voting with the left 78% of the time, Socialists voting with the left 85% of the time, 90% of the time Liberals voting with the Socialists, and Liberals only voting 60% of the time with EPP. So you can see how the dominant bloc, and we see over 2,500 votes on environment issues, which is an indication of the volume of legislation that has been passed in the last 5 years, the European Green Deal package. And this coalition has gradually eroded over time. At the beginning of the parliament, the EPP on the right were voting with the left on environment issues. And gradually this eroded over time. And by the end of the parliament, the most recent packages going through, the EPP and the German CDU inside that group were voting against. And it was only a few left-wing members of the EPP group, some of the Scandinavian Conservatives, plus the Irish Fine Gael party, they were voting with the left. And that package passed because it was a left-wing bloc plus these MEPs on the left wing of the EPP. That was the pro-environment bloc in the European Parliament. In the new Parliament, that will not be a majority. In the new Parliament, the losing side, the anti-environment bloc, will be the majority. And when we think about environment legislation, a lot of Green Deal stuff has been passed. There's still a lot of things still to do. And a lot of the legislation that has been passed, there's going to be follow-up legislation in the coming years, implementing legislation. And now the Commission is going to be facing a Parliament that's going to be much more critical of environment issues. And a similar thing on migration. So the big shift to the right in the Parliament has big implications, we think, on 2 policy issues, environment in particular, and migration, because it's EU legislation that's about policing external borders, regulation of asylum seekers and refugees. I'll skip to cohesion. So these are measures of how cohesive the groups are. How often do they really vote together? This is a score that goes from 0 to 100. You score 100 if all your MEPs all vote together in every vote on that particular issue. You score 0 if they're split down the middle. As a baseline, the parties in US Congress have a cohesion of about 80. Most national parliaments in Europe have a cohesion of around 95. You can see how the Greens here, highly cohesive. S&D, also cohesive. Environment is this blue here. You can see on environment, the Renew group, not that cohesive. EPP, not that cohesive. And these 2 groups on the right that are going to increase in size, currently not very cohesive compared to the mainstream groups in the parliament. ECR is going up compared to 10 years ago. And as it increases in power, we expect the cohesion to go up. In a sense, power leads to more cohesion because the possibility of you being able to influence policy means you get your troops in line. You organize whips, you deliver voting instructions, and you monitor what's going on. So we expect ECR, the cohesion will probably go up. Finally, I thought I'd say a few words about von der Leyen. So we all assume von der Leyen's going to get re-elected, don't we? Well, you know, she's a well-known Commission President. There's other research we've done to show that 75% of Europeans can actually know the name of the Commission President and know von der Leyen, compared to 5 years ago, only 40% knew Juncker, 75% know von der Leyen. She's the most known European politician other than Macron across Europe. On average, people think she's done a pretty good job. She took some big risks in vaccine rollout of Europe. She almost lost her job in the middle of that crisis, if you remember. She's been very active on the Ukraine issue. She was backed in the parliament by these 3 groups in the middle. In that vote, the vote is by a secret ballot. So nobody can really monitor how they vote, which makes it hard for the groups to enforce cohesion. And she has to win an absolute majority. That's not just a majority of the people voting. That's a majority of all the MEPs. So she has to win 50% plus one of all the MEPs. Last time round, these three groups had 58% of MEPs, but she actually won the vote by 8 votes. It was really tight. Clearly, a large chunk of the socialists didn't back her. They didn't want to support her. Then the commission was put together. The package deal of the other offices in the EU was put together. The portfolios in the commission were decided. Frans Timmermans from the Socialists was given a big, powerful portfolio. She made promises to deliver a lot of environment policy, and the coalition expanded to include the rest of the Socialists and a large proportion of the Greens. This time round, that coalition, if that's the coalition to vote for her, they will not win. She will not win the vote. The Socialists are already saying they're quite reluctant to support her. Most socialist parties are in opposition, so they're not in government. Only the SPD in Germany, PSOE in Spain, and the Maltese. I mean, the socialists are in government in Slovakia, but they're not in the socialist group. They were kicked out. So, you know, SPD might say, yeah, sure, we're going to back her. And PSOE will say, yeah, in Spain, Sanchez, we're going to back her. The rest of them are in opposition. Why do we have to back her? So when you think about PD in Italy, where I now live, they won't support her because she's too friendly with Meloni. Or we think about the French socialists. They're not going to support her because she's too friendly with Macron. So you think about that all across Europe and think the socialist group are going to increasingly become the opposition at the European level to this new bloc of right and centre-right MEPs, right and centre-right governments in the council, and right and centre-right commissioners. So a very different dynamic of European politics. And this might be very difficult then to get through the European Parliament. Last point here is the ones to watch, I think, could be the left wing of the EPP. If they decide that actually they might prefer a different commission president, and that could be a bloc, they are the new pivotal MEPs in the European Parliament. They're going to be in a very influential and powerful position. So just to wrap up very quickly, the European Parliament is going to see this big swing to the right, a big shift in the average member of the European Parliament, a big increase in MEPs to the right of the EPP. This could mean the European Parliament has very unstable and unpredictable coalitions compared to the current Parliament. The Grand Coalition won't be so easy to deliver. There won't be a clear centre-left majority on environment issues anymore. It's going to be much more fragmented and much more unstable, we think. And this could begin with it being quite difficult for von der Leyen to get elected. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon, for that fast and quick and interesting overview of your paper and what to expect and how the EP has been working. Now, I will ask Simon a question, but before that, please also raise your hand if you have questions direct to Simon about the presentation. Then we have some room for that as well. We already have one, so I will give directly to you. And you can please say your name and your affiliation.
Absolutely. Thanks for a great presentation. My name is Ulf Kruse. I run a business network called CBN. Today, there was a poll in Sweden saying that the biggest issue everyone is talking about regarding the upcoming election is the environment, which tends to be a little bit to the left. So have you taken that into consideration, that environment is important?
Yeah, so it's true that in the last few rounds of European elections, the environmental issue has been the most important issue that voters have thought about. When you think, what does Europe do? They think environment issues, because it's clearly something you need to do collectively at the European level, not just at the national level. But compared to 5 years ago, the environment issue has really receded in the minds of voters. So 5 years ago, there was a big mobilization of younger voters on the environment. When we think about Fridays for Future, and in France and Germany, there was a big turnout of voters under 35 and a big increase in votes, more than people were predicting for Green parties. So that doesn't feel like that's, although they tell the pollsters environment is the key issue, environment is not necessarily mobilizing so many pro-environment. In fact, the opposite is happening. Environment is often the key issue for people who are opposed now. When we think about the mobilization of the farmers and what, you know, if you think about the environment issue, it is evolved from being an issue where everyone could say, oh, we're all in favor of action to deliver, you know, to address climate change. It's evolved from that to now a conflict. A distributional conflict. Who's going to pay for this? How are they going to pay for this? You know, we now actually have to implement policies that cost. Somebody somewhere, there are now winners and losers from this. whether it's, nitrates in farming, or whether it's replacing your heat pump, or whether it's fuel prices. So when people say the environment is the key issue they care about, that's no longer just a left-wing issue. That's right-wing farmers saying the environment is the key issue and I'm opposed to it. So I think it's changed quite dramatically in what that means.
In your presentation, you talk about the fragility or fragmentation, increasing fragmentation, and the less likely chances of Ursula von der Leyen of being the next president of the European Commission again. And it all makes sense to me. Do you think there is anything, because now she is campaigning, she is the head of the EPP campaign to become the president of the Commission. Do you think there's anything in the campaign dynamics that will increase or decrease her chances of being Commission president?
I mean, I don't know, I was one of probably a small handful of people that watched part of the debate this week.
I did.
You were another EU nerd. And it was clear watching that she's pitching very much to the left. She realizes that that's her weakness. She's running on her record of, I delivered the most ambitious environment policy the EU's ever seen. And you couldn't put a piece of paper between her and the S&D candidate. And it was the ECR who were being more critical. And I think the strategy is going to be, EPP are going to back me, Renew Europe, or most of Renew Europe are going to back me, and then picking off different groups to support her. And clearly Meloni, Fratelli d'Italia are going to have a lot of MEPs. We're going to be one of the largest delegations. If she can deliver those, that's another big kind of tick in her column. If she can deliver some of the other parties in ECR, and then she's going to try and get SPD and PSOE and a few others. And maybe some of the Greens, perhaps the German Greens, could back her as well, and they'll have quite a few. So it's going to be, she's going to have to pick off, I think, national parties to support her. Whether or not that's enough, I'm not sure. But I find her very interesting in that if we go back to Delors was a left-wing politician that was trusted by the right. And she's a right-wing politician that's trusted by the left. So I find this very interesting to think about if she gets elected, what is she going to do in her second term, the way that Delors did in his second term.
But then again, isn't there a paradox? Because as you just said, there's likely going to be a more rightward leaning European Parliament at the same time as we've also seen over the last few years, a number of shifts in government across Europe that actually means that the Council is more rightward leaning, and probably the next Commission will also be more rightward leaning. So there's something about
I mean, this is a live debate, I think, in the socialist group about, do they then say we're going to go into opposition? We essentially we need to become an opposition party. They don't want to be associated with the EU moving in a rightward direction, having to defend that. Because for years, we think of the Social Democrats as defending Europe. We roll back 30 years ago, socialists were more critical of Europe and the right was more in favor. And now it's switched. It tends to be the left more favorable towards Europe because of what Europe does, environment policy, gender equality, non-discrimination, and so on. And it tends to be the right that says, oh, interfering, red tape, Brussels, free movement of people, we don't like it. If that starts to shift, if Europe starts to be fortress Europe, anti-migrant Europe, rolling back on environment commitments, does the centre-left want to be defending that? And so that's a kind of live discussion amongst a lot of social democratic parties across Europe. Maybe we should say, look, we're now in opposition. We're not in government. We've only got 2 prime ministers of any consequence. One of them, if von der Leyen gets elected, is not even going to be in the Commission anyway. We're going to have a Spanish commissioner and a Maltese commissioner, and that's pretty much it.
I wouldn't be accepted across the channel if I didn't mention that Denmark also has a social democratic prime minister. So
this is true.
Keep my Nordic free movement still. Seminar. We had a question in the back.
Thank you. I'm Love Hansson of the Swedish Confederation of Transport Enterprises, or Transportföretagen, for those of you who speak Swedish. Thank you for this interesting presentation and especially the excellent, visual representation of the close to zero chances for new, more ambitious environmental legislation being rolled out by the next Commission. In our analysis, we have been looking at the 2 scenarios of either, because obviously, just looking at the 455 legislation, you have more than 150 delegated responsibilities for the Commission, to roll out legislation that are passed unanimously by the Commission without having to ask Parliament or the Council. And obviously, being a business representative, we are very interested in looking at like long-term regulatory stability at this point in time. So do you see, because from what it looks like, the EPP will have a pivotal role in deciding whether the next commission focuses on getting implementation right or rolling back the general level of ambition in the Fit for 55 package and the Green Deal in general. So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And another aspect to that, of course, is the Draghi report that's going to be coming out this summer and what that means for the agenda of the next commission. I think the jury's still out on what the strategy of the EPP is going to be. Of course, the EPP is instinctively more business friendly than the centre-left on lots of these issues. But it's not clear what the view of some of the parties in the ECR. And if you think the EPP is sort of leaning rightwards on some of these issues, on some issues they're more libertarian, they don't want environmental interference, but they're not so business friendly on some other issues, for example. So I think the jury's a little bit out there on whether what the kind of economic policy framework for that new type of political coalition we've got at the European level. And it's not just in the Parliament. That, in a sense, is the new political coalition we're going to be seeing in the Commission. ECR parties. Meloni is going to have a really big portfolio, I would guess, in the Commission. She's actually been a very continuation of Draghi's policy when it comes to economics in Italy. So my hunch is that she is very close to a lot of the mainstream in the EPP on a lot of the regulatory issues. But the Draghi report, I was in Brussels talking to Daniel Gross, who used to run Sieps in Brussels, and he's now in Bocconi. And I said to him, you're optimistic about the Draghi report? He said, no, I'm not optimistic at all. The report's going to be typical Draghi. It'll be a sort of more of the same, please. And, more of the same is okay. But he said, I'm worried about the boiling frog phenomenon of the European economy gradually declining. More of the same has meant we've declined relative to a lot of the rest of the world. We need something very different, something quite radical. We need to think far more ambitiously and far more creatively, and that's not instinctively what Draghi does. And so he's worried about there not being enough ambition in the economic realm. One area where I think we don't know is defense. And of course, instinctively, that's von der Leyen's wheelhouse, meaning, she was defense minister. She's very strong on defense when it comes to Ukraine. I think there's a whole economic side to that in terms of more defense integration, more defense investment. And even though, the frugals, of course, are concerned about EU taxing and spending money, I think defense is one area where I think they could see the sort of industrial benefits of that sort of expenditure.
And also in relation to Ukraine, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Of course. Dimension.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Great questions from you. I would now like to welcome the two discussants up to join us here. And the two discussants are Susanne Palme, who is a senior experienced journalist and was until recently Swedish Public Broadcasting Radio's EU commentator, and Sofie Blombäck, who is a lecturer at Mid-Sweden University, and she's a political scientist specialized in parliaments and elections, among other things. So I will now let you make some introductory comments, reflections upon Simon's talk and this report. Was something you agree with, disagree with, or you want to add? And then we will have a common discussion also open for you with questions and comments. Susanne, could you please start?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Simon, for your interesting report. I agree with almost everything you say. As Göran said, I've been covering the EU for a long time. I've covered like 5 or 6 elections to the European Parliament. And actually every time, almost, there has been these warnings about the nationalist, populist, extreme right-wing gaining support and taking over the European Parliament. I remember traveling with the then European Affairs Minister, Birgitta Ohlsson, in her campaign in 2014. And that was the only thing she said. It's dangerous. This is a choice for the future of Europe and so forth. This never materialized. And it's been the same every time. But maybe it will happen this time. I don't know. But I mean, they have gained more seats, the Eurosceptics, the nationalists, but they are split. And most of those parties have never shown any interest whatsoever in working in the parliament with legislation and actually influencing the outcome of. So that's what we've seen so far. I mean, we've seen here they are divided. they're actually not very interested. And now they complain. The ID group, for example, said that there is this cordon sanitaire. They don't give us any positions like as negotiating reports and so forth. But I mean, would they have been interested really? I mean, that's what they say. But I think what we have seen during the last 5 or 10 years is a parliament that is more and more fragmentized, what do you say, more polarized. It's been difficult to find winning majorities, and there are different splits within group and between groups. But it was interesting to see the vote of the Migration Pact in April, because there was a Swedish MEP that was the chief negotiator of one of the files, and he said to me that I'm afraid that this won't pass, and he was lobbying individual MEPs, and I thought he was lying. I thought that he was saying this just to be like important and show that he's influential, whatever. But then when I saw the result of the vote, he was right. Actually, it was so narrow. And, you know, it was about like 10 legislative acts, and they were seen as a package. So if one fell, it would all fall. And what happened? Well, for example, the crisis regulation, it put the majority was just 26 votes. And those who abstained, if those had voted no, it would have fallen. And it was the same with the procedures regulation as well. I mean, and there was a lot of convincing of individual MEPs, for example, the polls in the EPP, please abstain, don't vote no. And what you could see afterwards was that it was the national delegations actually that decided the outcome. I mean, the Italian Social Democrats voted no. The French Conservatives, the Republicans voted no. Meloni voted yes. I mean, these are very big delegations, and that actually made the outcome. So I think that you've seen that so many times during this mandate, and maybe this will also, I mean, the Eurosceptic parties that will gain now, AFD in Germany, Brother of Italy, Vox, maybe, I don't know. They will be very big and have, I mean, really big. So how the position they take could just, you know, make the outcome. Then I was good. I agree with you that, I mean, maybe the Migration Pact, actually, it would not have passed in the new parliament, the next parliament, nor would probably the Fit for 55, the climate package. But now you see, for example, in Sweden, the Swedish Democrats are saying, we will go to parliament and we will undo all this legislation. And because this hurts businesses and so forth. But I mean, and they got a lot of attention, and that is what everybody says now. This big threat that the Fit for 55 will be repealed or whatever. But I think actually they are bluffing. This won't happen. This has been, the decision is taken, now it will be implemented. There is no interest. I mean, 27 countries are behind this. Ursula von der Leyen is behind this. And I mean, we can't look back, we have to look forward. And we don't know yet what will the new controversial issues be. We don't know that. And then I just want to say something about Ursula von der Leyen. I agree completely with you. I think journalists generally just assume that she will be elected. I mean, I saw this debate as well, and she's really competent if you compare the rest of the candidates. I mean, the others aren't really candidates anyhow. So. But I mean, but her position is very difficult. There she spoke of, in a way, I mean, everybody in the audience were Greens, and she defended the Green Deal and everything. But on a question, she said she was open to working together with the ECR group. That was Maloney. And the others were criticizing her. And there's a lot of, I mean, what will she do? She can't be sure of getting enough votes. And if she, now you can see the Greens, for example, this time love Ursula von der Leyen, and they want to work with her, and they would like to have like a coalition agreement with all the pro-European forces, saying that this will be what we do during the next mandate, and like that she would have to accept. But I mean, I really don't know how she will solve this. So I agree with you. It's not at all sure that she, and then what will happen? Well, some comments.
Great, Susanne. No, it's a tricky question, and as Simon put in his slide as well, turning to the right means perhaps also losing the center or the left at the same time. So there's some balancing act going on here. But we will now move to you, Sofie, and your comments, and then we continue the discussion.
Yes, thank you. And hard act to follow here, these two. But I will do my best to add some further comments. I haven't studied the EU for quite as long as the two of you have, but it's getting there in several decades now. And when I started studying the EU, one of the first things I was taught was that the European Parliament needs a stable, grand coalition in order to sort of solidify its position against the other institutions. That historically, the European Parliament has gained a lot of influence over the past couple of treaty negotiations, partly because of its ability to have this rhetoric of being the only directly elected body, but also because it has been able to challenge the Council and to some extent the Commission. So that was something that I was thinking about when reading this report, and also looking back at some reports made after the last election that have shown the increase, not only like shift in ideology, but the increase in fragmentation. And in political science term, that basically means not only how many parties, or in this case, party groups do you have, but how equal or unequal in size are they? Whereas sort of a perfect two-party system like the US has a very low score of fragmentation. It's two equally sized parties. But in the European Parliament, this has increased sharply over the past couple of elections. And looking at the opinion polls, it looks like it will go even further. So I was thinking a little bit about, I wonder what this will do to this sort of, not at the moment very prominent, but still sort of constant power struggle of the European Parliament in what it is in the European project. Not an easy question, I know, but I found it intriguing. And the second point I wanted to raise has been touched upon already, and it's this fact that these party groups on the far right have historically not been very stable and are still not cohesive in how they vote. But as Simon mentioned in the presentation, when you get power, this tends to change. We've seen this in national parliaments as well, with party groups of various populist shades that have sort of become more like the normal parties as they have been included in being able to form or influence policy. Or even in this case, I'm thinking the goal might not even be to influence policy, but to block policy. But even for that, you need cohesion. And in light of von der Leyen's comments of maybe working with ECR, depending on a little bit on how the parliament looks, during this debate that I think the four of us on the stage who were maybe the only ones watching, I mean, does it really matter? Or is the math going to make it necessary to collaborate to the right, even depending on sort of where Fidesz goes or who's actually included in this group?
Great. Thank you so much, Sophie. Great comments from both of you. And I'm sure there are a few things you want to pick up on, Simon.
Yes. Thank you both very much. expanding on a couple of points. So the point you raised, Suzanne, about, in the past, every election, we've said, oh my gosh, the European Parliament election is going to see the rise in the populist right. In every election, what has tended to happen is they've gone up, but not gone up quite as much as people feared they would go up. But there reaches a point, like in national parliaments, where there's no longer the rise of the populist right. They have actually risen. They are here. They are now a kind of coalitionable party that influences the formation of government. I mean, we've seen that in so many countries across Europe, and there's a certain point where they are no longer on the rise, they are now here. And this, I think, is the moment that happens at the European level, right? They've risen all the way along, but all the way along they've risen, and the opposition to them has stayed together and been able to govern without them. This is the moment, I think, where that will no longer be the case. They will need the same kind of thing that's happened in Sweden with the Sweden Democrats. You can think about this being the Brussels equivalent of that moment. And it's not just the European Parliament, it's also the other institutions. You see that the big difference, as opposed to 5 or 10 years ago, when we've seen an increase in the populist right MEPs, we didn't see them in government in many countries, if any. Now, when we look in the council or we think about the commission, we think about there being quite a block of politicians in Brussels representing the governments and also sitting in the commission who are going to be from these parties to the right of the EPP. So that's a very different prospect. And I think that does fundamentally change how we think about EU politics. And then coming to Sophie's point, I think the fragmentation, you're absolutely right. This is the Parliament will be a far less reliable partner for governments, much more unstable, much less predictable. The only hope, if you like, for there being a sort of cohesion in the EU as a whole, the EPP will become the very dominant force. They will be the dominant big group across all 3 institutions. They, in a sense, will be the political glue that is holding it together. So if, like you said, I mean, we all believe von der Leyen's going to get re-elected, we just don't know how. I mean, I think that's basically my view. I find it hard to imagine she's not, but I still can't do the maths to work out how actually that's going to happen. But if she does, I think she becomes quite a pivotal player in the EPP as the glue that's holding the different parts of the institutions together. And they will build coalitions issue by issue, sometimes with ECR and the Liberals, sometimes with the Socialists and even the Greens. And so I think they might be the heart of what really becomes Brussels politics.
What about then, if indeed the Parliament is very fragmented and it's very hard to find majorities, how would you then think the other institutions or member states would react? Already in this mandate, European Parliament is criticizing member states for using the fast-track kind of legislation whereby they are not involved. Would that be a possible scenario?
We've seen that. We've seen that in the past, meaning that on certain issues where the Parliament looks quite unreliable, the governments have tried to think, how can we do this without involving the Parliament? And of course, the Parliament isn't powerful in all issues. So there's a whole range of policy questions where the Parliament is there for passing legislation, but there's a lot of acts or instruments or actions that the EU does, which is not legislation. When we think about the big topics coming up, there's going to be the multi-annual financial framework, there's enlargement, there's defence cooperation, there's a whole range of issues where the Parliament won't really have so much role. And so I can see a lot of those issues being the sort of the government saying, look, let's just focus on this stuff because the Parliament is completely unreliable. That said, there are some commitments within the Green Deal that mean they will have to implement more legislation. There's commitments in the migration package, which means they will have to implement more legislation. There's going to be some follow-up from the Draghi report, which would relate to more perhaps liberalization of services in the single market, which will require legislation. So there are some issues where they will have to act in legislation, and that's going to be tricky. But I can imagine the focus being, for example, on defense, a sort of, a new commissioner, a powerful commissioner dedicated to defense, that being a real issue that becomes one of the dominant issues for von der Leyen.
Particularly depending on the results in the American presidential elections, I assume.
In some ways, the more important election is the one in November, but we'll see.
We'll see. Now, I will open for questions and reflections from the audience, but before that, I would just one question back to you, Simon. I mean, you're basing this on forecast models, and I know you've been working with forecast models, but again, relating to Susanne's question, that many times the main narrative ahead of European elections has been the surge of the radical right. And yet last time around, the outcome was something quite different, or slightly different at least. So how reliable are these forecasts?
So these are European elects. So I used European elects here. Europe elects is an NGO in Brussels that collects all the opinion polls from all across Europe, and really nice online public accessible website. It's a very good public good that they provide. So all the elections across Europe, and so they aggregate the opinion polls. We have actually, and we launched with the European Council for Foreign Relations a few weeks ago, a forecast based on a statistical model, which is slightly different. And actually, we looked back 5 years ago and said, how did our forecast compare to theirs? And we actually did better, slightly better. Why? Because systematically, as you got closer to the elections, the opinion polls matched the outcome. But 4, 5, 6 months out, the opinion polls are about national politics, not European politics. And so they don't capture the green wave that happened in those elections. When we have a model that looks back all of what happens in European elections, we find Greens do systematically slightly better. Populist right parties do systematically slightly better than the polls. Governing parties do slightly worse. So we had a model that factored those things in. And so we got closer for the Greens than they did. The big difference this time around, as I mentioned, is, if we're going to be wrong, in which direction are we going to be wrong? I worry we're going to be wrong on there being even more that way than wrong more this way, actually. Whereas in 2019, I was worried the other way around, because the big uncertainty in 2019 was, are the young people going to vote, and are they going to come out mobilized for green issues? What's the question now? The question now is, are the farmers going to mobilize people to vote, and are they going to mobilize against European policies and mobilize the rural communities to come out and vote against Europe? That, to me, is the question. And that if that's not being picked up in the polls, we could see even more votes for the right than for the left.
They're clearly mobilized in terms of vehicles, at least, already. Yes. This is what you can see across Europe. Sofie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, can I just tag on a question here? Because you sort of got into it towards the end, but I think that one of the things that makes the European Parliament elections more challenging, at least compared to, for example, studying election polls here in Sweden, is that turnout is much more of an issue. When you know that roughly the same people are going to vote this time around that did it last time around, then it's quite easy to, not easy, but easier to extrapolate. But I mean, you have such huge differences in turnout from country to country, and also you can see bigger swings. And I imagine that's tricky to take into account, but is that part of what you're doing? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so
in a very nerdy way.
But the reason why, say, Europe elects got it wrong 5 years ago, or particularly underestimated the Greens, was largely a turnout effect. Turnout went up in the 2 biggest member states with the 2 most MEPs, France and Germany, and that turnout was systematically younger voters, and systematically younger voters voting for the Greens. Yeah. Very, very difficult to predict that. So turnout went from 46 to 50 and a bit, I think last time, 50.3, something like that. We were taking bets last night at dinner on what turnout would be this time around.
Not to make public.
But I think we were saying, I expect turnout to fall back to the normal trend. Trend has been slightly up, and then you got this big jump last time. I expect it to come down high 40s, something like that. And if that's the case, then the normal forecast should work quite well in that sense.
Some say now that, well, I mean, in the last Eurobarometer, more, I think 70% said that they would vote. Yes. And then, I mean, you had the corona pandemic, you had the war in Ukraine, so forth, where the EU actually managed, to get vaccines and so forth. But that Europe is needed. But since then, you have the farmers. But do you think actually that issue can overshadow the whole thing?
It's really, really difficult to predict turnout with any reliability. And again, I'll be standing on a platform in July saying, "Oh, here's why turnout was 70%." Actually, we know exactly why. I mean, it's like after the fact, we always tell a story about what the issues were that mobilized things, and we couldn't have predicted it. So I'm a bit reluctant to.
It's much easier to explain when you have the results.
Exactly.
But in the same poll that Susanne mentioned, I recall that the Swedish voters said that 8 out of 10 think that it's likely they will vote, although we had 55% participation last time around. But then there was a second question. Do you think that the ongoing war in Ukraine makes it more likely that you will vote in European Parliament elections? And it was 95% of Swedish voters. But to me, that sounds like a question there is no easy way to answering no to it. Yeah. But just to say that perhaps this has a mobilizing effect somewhere where turnout has been very low.
Yes. Did it come down again? And not in terms of turnout, but the Swedish support for the EU peaked in 2022.
That's true.
Back in 2023, it's already started to, I mean, it's still high.
No, but it is, I mean, that's another factor. I mean, there's two sort of slightly paradoxical things going on at the same time. One is growing support across Europe for populist right parties, and the other one is rising support for the European Union. And in some ways, they're not quite as paradoxical as it might seem, in that the populist right have changed their views on Europe over the last 5 to 10 years. Then they're more critical of the EU, but they're not explicitly anti-European. They're not in favor of Swexit or Dexit or Italexit, or, you know, they were talking about all that stuff before Brexit. And now the view is, we don't want to leave the EU. We want a different sort of EU. We want to be in the EU. We want to run the EU. We want to kind of fortress Europe EU. We want to protect European business and European society and European civilization, which is a euphemism for a range of different things. You know, they want to turn Europe into their kind of Europe rather than saying we want to tear the whole thing down. And so that, I think, is quite a big change in the way they see the institutions and the process.
I have a question in the back.
Yeah. Thank you for a great presentation. I think there's many of us in this room have greatly benefited from your textbooks about European political partners over the years. So thanks for that. My name is Magnus Norman. I founded something which we call Impact Europe, which aims to build bridges between Sweden and the EU. Previously spent almost 20 years in the Parliament, Commission and Council at political and civil servant level. On the debates, I mean, I fully agree that the debates will have no impact on the election result whatsoever, unless von der Leyen makes a very, very big mistake, you know, that she can make. But she very well balanced her stance against the ECR at the debate that we watched on Monday. And I also agree that there are dark clouds coming in, you know, on her re-election, but still the European Council will have to unite behind a different candidate. I mean, now we speak about her chances of being elected in Parliament, but of course, first of all, the European Council, so the heads of states in Europe, they need to unite behind a different candidate. That I see very, you know, unlikely to happen, but who knows? And then I would then argue that the portfolios and the distribution of commissioner portfolios, which usually happens at the end of this process, will now happen much sooner, because Ursula von der Leyen will have to get the support of the, you know, Melonis, for example. So Meloni, they will get, I don't know, 40 seats in Parliament or something, 30, 40, 50 seats. So in order to get their green light, she would have to speak with the Italian government, and that means that she would have to get saying, so we want this portfolio, but then we need your support. So, you know, this sort of von der Leyen coalition will be so much more complex this time. And the coalition, I mean, it will be unprecedented levels of backroom deals, political horse trading that, you know, at least I've never seen before. So I think that's sort of one important perspective that one can also bring into this discussions. But again, thanks a lot for
a summer of horse trading.
I absolutely agree with that. In fact, we were discussing this a little earlier when we were thinking, how might this work? And I you know, the advantage, of course, is she's the sitting incumbent. So, you know, the way that's been difficult to coordinate in the past when you haven't got somebody already elected as commission president who can then start the negotiating process. She can start that process earlier. But it does take time. So the elections are in June. Normally July is the summit where the European Council nominates the commission president. I don't think that's enough time. I expect that they might try and get her through the Parliament in July, but they would already do their counting. And if they can't be sure that she's going to get through, they won't put her to a vote in July. They'll hold back and they'll say, we have to build that package. They have to line up the other top jobs. Which of the key jobs they're going to give to the Socialists and Democrats, S&D? Which job are they going to give to the Liberals? Which job are they going to give to the Polish government and the Italians? And they're going to build that jigsaw puzzle. And then that package is going to be put to Parliament in September. And that, I think, would increase the probability that she's going to get. So that's quite a delicate process. And you can already see reading between the lines in the debate on Monday, you can see the sort of balance she's trying to do. She's going to have to try and signal something strong on environment to keep some of the Greens and the centre left on board. She's going to have to give Spain something big to keep Sanchez on board. And so you can see the kind of package she's putting together. So I agree. I think the package is going to be EPP plus most of the Liberals plus a few key socialists and Democrats and perhaps even a Greens and a few key ECR. And that should be enough to get her enough votes in the parliament.
So that's also an interesting point, though, the strength of the European parties. But we can come back to that because we have many hands in the air. We give now a question to you.
Yes,
it's on. Yeah.
Thank you. Thomas, I'm from representing Unionen, Sweden's largest trade union. A question to the panel, but also to Sieps. But looking at the data and the projections for the next parliament, single market letter report, which came out a week or two ago, at the heart of the whole European project, of course, and the whole message in his report is more harmonization, more single market, deepening, and also more money. But provided what you have shown us that the parties to the right of the EPP, which are more in favor or proponents of a Europe of member states or nations than EPP, and parties to the left, more the Greens being the most maybe federalist party of them all or group. What's your take on the feasibility of deepening the single market when parties to the right of the EPP will increase their share in the parliament? Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Any takers?
Yeah, I mean, it relates a little bit to the question. I mean, there's on the one side, there's Letter, and then we're also going to have Draghi, and the next commission is going to have to try and weave between this for what the strategy is for the single market. I agree that, you know, one of the big challenges, and in a sense, this current commission has not taken on because it's been derailed, of course, by COVID and then by Ukraine and focusing on the Green Deal. The other aspect of where she started from 5 years ago was meant to be generating growth in the European economy. And that kind of now we're back with that agenda, whether it's Letter or whether it's Draghi. This is going to be how do you generate growth in the European economy? I actually think services are going to come back in as which the trade union movements across Europe are going to be very uncomfortable with, particularly if there's more regulated services markets. But that, I think, is a lot of that's where the centre right or the radical right, a lot of small business support over there and private traders. I mean, it's clear Maloney is like the taxi driver's prime minister. She's the first thing she did was allow people to pay cash and allow people to not have to allow businesses to say, we're not taking card payments. I mean, that was the very first action she did of her government, which was hugely popular amongst Italian restaurant owners, as you can imagine. Right? So suddenly, one day to the next, you go to a restaurant in Italy and they say, no, we're not taking card. You're like, what? So you can see kind of the small business agenda. I think liberalizing markets is very different to what Letter was asking for. But I think that could be part of the core of thinking about how do we create a flexible single market that generates growth in the sectors where we're seeing growth in return, in a sense, for environment standards. And we have the environment standards on the regulatory side, but we have a kind of deregulation of small business or deregulation of certain sectors. And I think the trade unions across Europe are going to find that very difficult.
At the same time as you have a geoeconomic and geopolitical context in which, for instance, President Macron last week, when he outlined his priorities in this field, calls for much more, let's say, public engagement and investment and even some protection, if some would argue, in this field. So for sure, it's going to be a big agenda. I will now move on to the next question.
Yes, thank you. Hanna Sjölund from the trade union Vision, not the biggest, but fifth biggest in Sweden.
With most visions.
Exactly, right, the visionaries. I just found it interesting what you said, Susanne, in relation to the cordon sanitaire. And I found it interesting in relation not just to the numbers when you look at the far right parties and the party groups, but also where the influence on the content, who gets to be rapporteur, etc. And I just thought that there would be interesting to hear if you have any more thoughts on that.
So,
you want to go, Susanne? Or?
Susanne?
During this, there is a cordon sanitaire against one group, the ID, but the ECR is that's different, a different story. And but now the ID is actually, I mean, they have started talking differently now. They say we want positions, we want to negotiate, and be rapporteurs. And I mean, I think it will be very difficult to say no. I mean, you can't say no. It was easy before, but now I think this whole system is very rare, strange, actually.
Sofie, do you want to add?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, this is a process, I think, where you can draw a lot of parallels to national parliaments. You can't do that with everything in the European Parliament, but this, I think, is one of the cases where we have seen around Europe, I guess, parties, like every party that's not sort of part of the establishment, so to speak. It happened earlier with the parties on the far left, to some extent the Green parties, but more recently with the parties on the far right, is that once it becomes necessary for the established parties to work with these challengers in order to get their policies through or to be able to form a government and so on, they tend to do that. But it's also usually followed by a moderation. You have to become sort of coalitionable, but where the line for that is, that tends to shift. So I would be surprised if the European Parliament works any way differently. It's actually more surprised me that it hasn't happened sooner, because we tend to pay less attention to what happens. It was a big deal, for example, here when Tidöavtalet was formed. But I don't know if we would have paid as much attention if it happened in the European Parliament.
The agreement is the agreement between government and Sweden's
Democrats. Yeah.
So currently in the Parliament, it's this sense, and it's for practical reasons, I think, to get the Parliament working. They've said ECR inside the tent, ID outside the tent. I don't think that's sustainable, because they've sort of tried to draw that line. There's an increasing number of parties in the EPP centre-right who are actually in government with parties further to their right, or have been in government, or have been supported by, if we go down the list, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Austria, Italy, the Netherlands now, Spain, PP in opposition are talking about going into government with Vox. There aren't many left who now have that cordon sanitaire. France, Poland, Germany, Portugal. And it works the other way around. If you're sitting in ID and you're thinking, this is the cordon sanitaire. The cordon sanitaire in practical terms in the Parliament means ECR get committee chairs, get to write reports on legislation, get to be inside the debates when it comes to reforming negotiating with the council and so on, was ID outside. If you're sitting in ID and you're a big party like Le Pen, you're saying, why am I sitting here? Maybe I should join those guys. And if you're those guys, you're thinking, Le Pen, look how many MEPs she's got. Come on in. So, you think about Wilders. Why is he beyond the cordon sanitaire if he's now going to go into government with parties in EPP? And why is Laurent Justice inside the cordon sanitaire when Tusk would never want to do any business with him at all? So I think it doesn't make so much sense as it used to. And I think there are I imagine, my bet is there will be a shift in the membership of those two groups after the election. There'll be a kind of realignment, and we could end up with
one contentious issue that has been dividing these groups is Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
So how would you assess that? It needs to be lower salience, or shift the positions, or recalibrations of some sort in this?
That's true. And I think that has been a big dividing line, particularly with Laurent Justice running ECR and some of the parties in ID, and also with Orban, who sits in the non-attached. But now was a real surprise to me. Laurent Justice, the Polish party on the radical right, asked Orban to consider joining ECR. Right? So this is a shock. They totally disagree on attitudes towards Russia and towards Sweden. Why have they decided this? Because Laurent Justice are now no longer in government. They're now in opposition. It's much less salient for them. They're thinking no one's going to really notice what happens in the Parliament, whereas now if they sit with us in the Parliament, we're an even bigger group and we're even more powerful.
Bringing 10 or 12 seats.
Exactly. So it's much more, possibly 14 in the next election. So I think it's starting to shift. I think the Ukraine war is going down the news agenda slightly, with there being more or less stalemate on the battlefield. This has reduced the salience of the initial conflict. It might rise again, of course, but I think the declining salience, some of these parties being in opposition that were very anti doing business with Orban, I think there's a few things that have meant it much easier to do deals on the right in the Parliament.
But for Ursula von der Leyen, Russia and Ukraine is the red line, she says.
Yeah, but it's the red line for, I think, at the governmental level when she's dealing with governments. But she very much relied on Meloni to get the deal done with Orban, with the most recent package. And when it comes to groups in the parliament, she'll be quite happy to talk to various people inside ECR as long as they bring the other guys along with them. So I think it's not quite as clean as it used to be.
And it's a difference between a colonel senator of a party and or a party group.
Yes, that's right.
I think might happen if you see, for example, as you mentioned, these examples of parties that might join the ECR, if the ECR is inside the colonel, then maybe we will redraw the red lines to say no party groups that are officially pro-Russia, but if they have a certain number of national delegations in them, we'll just,
It you seem to be argued that there's a very strong impact of domestic politics right now in the European Parliament, no? That
It always has been. And I think the key party to watch is the CDU. Because the CDU, the current line very much in Berlin is no business with the AfD, of course. And the AfD, with all the scandals now currently with the AfD, they've lost a little bit of support. But there's 3 German land elections coming up in September. 2 in early September, 1 in later in September in the former East German part of the country. And Thuringia is going to be the first of these, and AfD could emerge as the largest party in this parliament. And then the CDU have a decision to make. Do the CDU perhaps form a minority government supported on the backbenches by AfD? Or does AfD form a government with CDU supporting them on the back? I mean, there's going to, and the Länder parties at the local level are very different to the party in Berlin. And as you know, the elements inside the CDU are fighting over what that strategy should be. So there's the official line of the CDU, and then there's different politicians within it wanting different strategies. So they really are caught. And once they switch position towards AfD in East Germany, that has resonance not just in Berlin, it also has resonance in Brussels in terms of what happens with the EPP group.
Question from the side.
Thank you. Thank you for an interesting presentation. My name is Daniel Barr, coming from the Swedish FSA. Decision-making in EU is different from national decisions. We might now see a change in Parliament, European Parliament, some weeks ahead. However, the European Council will stay the same, at least in the short run. What would that mean? Would we have major rollback of reforms like climate, migration, Ukraine, whatever, or we will see a deadlock between the Parliament and the Council, and nothing will be done for some time?
Yeah, the Council, changes more slowly over time as governments change, and I think that partly explains why the sort of pro-climate coalition started to erode over time, because it started to erode not just in the Parliament, it started to erode also in the Council. So if I could put up some pictures here of the Council left to right and show the same gradual shift rightwards. Ironically, we're going to have quite a similar block of politicians in the Parliament, in the Council and the Commission. So in a sense, we've got unified government across the 3 institutions on the centre right. That means they should be able to do business. When we had this in the late 1990s, in 1999, the EU was dominated by the centre left. It was dominated by a left-wing bloc in the Parliament, 13 out of 15 left-led governments in the Council, the majority of left-wing commissioners. And they had quite a radical agenda. That was the beginning of the environmental agenda. There was the sort of a lot of the labour market, the working time directive, non-discrimination directive, a whole range of things that came through. Could we see a similar, if they can define what that agenda is, then potentially they do have a coalition across all 3 institutions to be able to deliver it. Trade union probably wouldn't be happy with that. I'm talking to political scientists, not as a voter. But so I think there is a potential for them, particularly if they decide they want to actually do something with the economy, deregulating the single market, making the single market more flexible. That could be an agenda they come together with across all 3 institutions.
But then again, isn't there a problem with forming the majority nonetheless inside the European Parliament? Sophie, was that your point?
That was not my point, but I take it anyway. No, I just wanted to add on to where you started with these, decision making is different, and I think that's a bit challenging when talking about European Parliament elections. Sometimes is the Parliament does not have the power of legislative initiative. which I suspect most people in this room maybe know, but most voters do not. And that makes it very, very hard. I mean, a lot, like the way the political parties normally campaign is to promise to do stuff. But in the European Parliament, they can't actually force the issue, so to speak. And that should make the campaign different, but it doesn't, which I find from a sort of democratic standpoint fascinating, because for that, the makeup of the council is much more important than what the member states actually want. So that's sort of something to keep in mind. But what I think might be more realistic, that I see some trends in what you're talking about now, is actually not promising to do stuff, but promising to stop stuff, which is where this increased fragmentation might be a problem for the European Parliament or the European project as a whole. You can't promise to make EU pass a certain law, but you could conceivably promise to stop a proposal. And you don't even have to have inter-party cohesion to do that. You just have to say no.
That's true.
That's also something, stopping instead of going forward.
I
wanted to hear if there are something online who want to ask a question. There is nothing. Do we have a final question from the audience before we stop? Yes, we go here, a quick one, and then we are out.
Having more, Ulf Kruse again, having more populistic and right-wing parties often pictured as a bad thing. Now, what will be the good thing coming out of it? Will there be like a pressure on the cost of EU, on the administration as such? Maybe see someone criticizing the move to Strasbourg every whatever week?
Yeah, so there's a kind of general and a specific response. The general response is, you know, of course, your average social scientist and overwhelmingly my students are sort of liberal left in their orientation, and they're horrified at the rise of the populist right. And I remind my students, much to their horror, that, you know, we've seen dramatic social and economic changes over the last 30 years. Rising economic inequality, rising regional inequality, fundamental transformation of education, urban-rural divisions, deindustrialization, technological change. If that isn't reflected in politics, then democracy is not working, right? So I think the jury is still out on what the consequences are of the rise of the populist right. And I think it all depends on how the mainstream parties respond. Do they respond to trying to address the sort of core structural problems that have led to the rise of the populist right? Or they just go around saying, don't vote for these guys, they're all horrible. I mean, so it's like, I think a lot of it depends on how the mainstream respond to that. And I think a lot of it depends on how the mainstream respond to this at the European level. I mean, there are some issues, as you mentioned, where actually, if this leads to more coverage of European politics, more coverage of the European Parliament, more bust-ups in the Parliament, I'll be delighted. You know, it means that there's more transparency and accountability of what the EU does and more people engaging and being interested in European politics. That would be a good thing for the democratic deficit.
You know that Simon has written a book that's called "What's Wrong with the European Union and How to Fix It." So be sure to know that there are
needs
some
to be a second edition.
Sophie, do you want to final?
It was very much a similar point, but I think a very concrete pro of having sort of these populist actors could be something as simple as increased turnout.
Yes.
If there is someone to vote for, if you have this, like going back to the 90s where you have the permissive consensus and everybody is in favor and nothing is politicized, people stay at home.
When there are things at stake, they show up.
Yeah. Exactly. So, and it also binds the people who are dissatisfied with politics as it is into the democratic system rather than only having an outlet by going out in the street and demonstrating. Of course, you can do that as well, but it might sort of, there has been some hypothesis that this could work as a sort of deterrent from going more extreme. You can vote for a party that wants to oppose the status quo rather than trying to overturn it violently.
You know from election studies that when asking those who did not turn out to vote for European elections, the most common answer is that they didn't quite know what the elections were about. Yeah. So at least helping that. And with that, I hope that we have helped a little bit in understanding what's at stake and how the outcome of the election might potentially affect the European Union. I want to thank Sofie Blombäck, Susanne Palme, and of course, a great thanks to Simon Hix. It's also great that we have still British people explaining to us how European Union works.
We got right to the end before you brought it up.
And thanks to all of you for coming and SNS for co-organizing. Have a lovely day.